Some desires, as small and self-contained as they may seem to some, threaten the structure of our society so much that many different mechanisms must be deployed to deny them at their root. Sometimes these desires are openly condemned. Much of the time, though, they are simply made invisible or ridiculous, unnatural or other, to convince populations that they could not possibly desire that. In the meantime, other ways of being are broadcast as the unquestioned default setting. It's a bit like when you see ads on TV or YouTube or Instagram, and you find yourself thinking, regardless of your actual needs, maybe I do want that multi-fruit slicing tool, or period underwear, or multi-pocketed, waterproof, recycled material cycling bag, or whatever your targeted ads are for. It's the same with straight culture. You grow up seeing movies idealising the straight romance, hearing in school about what precautions to take while having straight sex, becoming very aware of the expected trajectory of getting a straight marriage, a straight mortgage, and straight kids. And you find yourself thinking, regardless of your actual sexuality, I suppose I'll have what they're having. When I was younger, it wasn't like I was seeing many other products advertised. Heterosexual culture had, and still has, despite what the woke bashers seem to think, a pretty aggressive viral marketing campaign going on. Like the jokes and comments that were made at my school by students and by teachers. They had many of us retelling the same jokes, the same comments. Self-policing, a most effective tool. I did not see myself reflected around me or in culture, did not see queer women depicted as normal or natural. So for a long time, I did not see myself at all, like a vampire looking into a mirror. There is still a fear of the witch, of the widow, of the dyke, all who do not meet men in order to thrive or survive. And so that fear creates the need for sidelining, ostracizing, othering, invisibilizing the lesbian, the queer woman, the witches in our midst. Because if women do not stay in heterosexual line, who will give birth to and raise the next generation of patriarchs? If you consider yourself straight, that might sound a little far-fetched. Classic lesbian man-hating. Incidentally, a trope that is a good example of the othering and ostracizing. But do you remember the moment when you realised you were straight? Or was it just an assumption? Have you ever considered straying outside of that? Or considered who else you might desire? What stops you from considering? Or from acting on those considerations? For centuries, and until today in many places, including on this island, many of us have been denied the possibility of recognising our own desires as queer women. Because of the knowledge and power inherent in those desires, the knowledge that the so-called natural, heterosexual order of the world is far from natural, but rather imposed with force every day, in tiny and massive ways. The power to move beyond that order and to build other orders, other kinds of relations, other kinds of worlds. So, why not consider it? There's a money-back guarantee. Paul, how would you understand desire within your own field?
So I suppose traditionally, if we think about desire, it's really about the pursuit of pleasure. So the hedonistic fulfillment, we want to maximize positive emotion. And that's something it's like an evolved signal in our humanity to signal our needs are being met. But if we think of desire more broadly than that, desire really is global. And there's a different way we should, or a more inclusive way we should think about desire. And those things include engagement, so feeling in the flow, feeling that time has stopped and when you're engaged in an activity. watching Summerfolk last night was a nice impression of that degree of engagement where people were fully absorbed in a flow state. There's also relationships. We're social creatures. We need others to love us, to tell us that they value us in important ways. So social instinct pushes that need. There's also the life of meaning. And research is telling us now that things might be meaningful if they're self-fulfilling, but people gain a lot more in terms of contributing to something which is bigger than themselves. So be that a social, a political need, be that creativity, be that spirituality. So these things are important aspects of our desires. And lastly, accomplishment. Sometimes we are uncomfortable about feeling pride, but if we've strived for something and we've really worked for it, we should feel pride in that, and we should acknowledge that. So desire is much more than the pursuit of positive emotion. It's all of these things, so there's a global aspect to it.
Michael, same question for you.
I am representing the plant party today. And we have to be careful because plants don't conjure desires amongst themselves, but because the way they've evolved, 400 million years insects have been eating plants, then they have conjured desire in other organisms. And if we consider the desire that we have for plants, then we desire them as food. We desire sweetness. We desire the orange or the apple. We desire them as pieces of art. We wish to collect them, to own them. The most expensive tulip bulb ever cost in present-day value $178,000. And that was for one tulip bulb in 1637. And this mania for collecting tulips almost bankrupted most of the merchants in Holland. And also, we have this desire to, dare I say it, get out of our heads on certain chemicals that plants produce. And it's wonderful to consider that all ancient civilizations either have a plant or a fungi, licking a toad or a fish, to get high. And hopefully we can discuss that in more detail. But also the final sort of desire of humans for plants is to control them. And we see genetically modified organisms being a point of debate. And we are trying to control a plant so that it can respond better to a chemical, or it can produce more nutrition-specific proteins. So my take-home message for this initial statement is that plants have created desire for plants in other organisms.
So do desires always stem from needs, Paul?
Desires, in a sense, our desire when it's focused on pleasure is quite insatiable and easy to manipulate. So we're made to believe those needs are very salient, I think. So a good example of that is the hedonic treadmill. And this is the basic idea in psychology and neuroscience, that we desire something, we pursue it, but then once we have it, we get used to it, we habituate to it. And then we need to find something else which is pleasurable for the source of our desire. And this may have been useful in many ways in our evolutionary history. It ensures that we get a variety of different nutrients, and we get a balanced diet, and we explore our environment effectively. But it's problematic in our modern society in terms of how we can be manipulated. So the hedonic treadmill is the idea that we're running on the spot, trying to aspire to get things, and once we get them, we get used to them, which is so. You get a new fashion item, it gives you initial thrill. You buy a new phone, it gives you a thrill. You get eat some ice cream, and the first taste is lovely, and then the second not so nice, and by the end of the tub, you've completely habituated to that pleasure. And these things can be manipulated in ways which are quite sinister. So we take social media, for example. everyone's familiar with the drag down scroll to get the next post to come up. That's actually part of what's called persuasive design. And this is based on the idea of variable reinforcements to try and keep us engaged, because we don't know when the post is going to occur. And this comes from people who've done work on casino slot machines to keep us engaged. So there's these things that on the surface appear fairly trivial and interesting, but there's a whole industry designed to capture our attention and sell our attention to advertisers. So that is a concern. And if that can be manipulated, it's taking our time away from all the other things, the engagement, the relationships, the meaning in life, the accomplishments, and that industry is going to become more powerful over time. So that's a concern.
You want to respond?
I do, yes, because this idea that plants are hedonistic or organisms, it's very dangerous. We tend to want to put human emotions on everything. It's the way that we attempt to explain nature. And there is an unfortunate trend where people are considering plants as sentient organisms. Now, it's true that plants are aware of their environment. They have, in a way, a visualizing system. They can smell chemicals. They can search out other plants by locking into volatile chemicals. Interestingly, what they can't do is hear. And there were some awful books published in the 1960s, one of which was called The Sound of Music and Plants. And it sort of crept into popular literature, this idea that if you played Mozart to plants, then they grew better. It said more about the person that actually designed the experiment than anything else. But it's interesting, this requirement to explain nature in human emotions. And in a way, if I can sort of say, plants are cleverer than that. What they've done is they've conjured up this idea that they are clever. I think it's a dangerous pathway to go, this anthropomorphism of plants, because what would happen if we convince ourselves that plants are sentient? What on earth could we eat?
I want to ask about something else.
Here endeth the second lesson.
Why are some desires considered unnatural? Paul?
I think traditionally because they're taboo, certain desires may be taboo. And if you think of eroticism and how that might be looked at through the lens of psychology, in a way it's a way to temporarily release our self-contained identity to connect with somebody else at a deeper level. And the more thrilling, more exciting that is, the more it breaks societal boundaries, is something we want to strive towards to understand our identity. There's not a clear neuroscience perspective on this, so you can always turn to Freud. Freud talks about Thanatos, the death instinct, and Eros, the life instinct. And there's a notion that as you're coming of age and you're reaching a point where you're grappling with society's expectations and your own true desires, things that you need, there needs to be some cannibalism or self-destruction of societal values which are not useful to you or not relevant to, don't define you in any way. And you need time to break that down. So that can be reflected in self-destructive behavior. And it's peeling back the layers of society to discover the life instinct and what really reflects your true desires. And it's difficult because of the influence of media today, of the influence of parental expectations and societal standards. Yeah.
Is it possible to have a distinction between your intrinsic desires and ones that are influenced by the environment in psychology?
Your intrinsic desires, I think there's always conflict between the two at some level. It's challenging in that way. I think that one thing we might ask ourselves, we're very poor at what's described as effective forecasting. And this is the idea that we think we know what we want, and then when we get it, it's perhaps not what we believed at first. So I mean, I can use an example maybe from myself and Mike's discipline of academia. You know, you want, it'd be great if we got published in Nature or Science, or it'd be great if we got a big grant worth hundreds of thousands so we could do what we really wanted to do. But we fail to appreciate sometimes the irrelevance of that goal in terms of our everyday existence. So this relates to the idea of all of us saying, if I can just achieve this, I'll be happy. If I can just do that, then I'll reach this plateau of happiness and that'll be fine. But the reality is, like, if I do get published in Nature, in a couple of weeks' time, I'll still be waiting for the guy who was supposed to come to fix the gas boiler who didn't turn up again. And then I'll still be in Dundrum with my family moaning about being stuck in the shopping. And I can't at that point go, well, I got published in Nature, because it doesn't translate to that level. So this relates, I think, to, again, a really interesting Jungian psychoanalytic perspective. Instead of asking yourself what makes you happy, ask, will a life decision enlarge you or will it diminish you? And I think the framing of that question is interesting, because it doesn't address an object of desire, I want this and then I'll be happy. It asks you something different, which is instinctual. You kind of know whether the energy you have inside you will rise up to support you in a particular task or whether it will diminish you. And people know this instinctually. And this does actually speak to, in part, what we know about in neuroscience. A lot of what drives us is outside our conscious awareness. It's just not easily accessible. So we do have to look for kind of indirect signatures of what we really desire. So it's tricky.
Sinful desire.
I wanted to come back to the plants. To ask, you talked about anthropomorphizing, but what about if we reverse it? If we do plant-thropomorphizing, you'll correct me with the right term there. In terms of, from what I know, the sex lives of plants are very varied, and plants are not necessarily, they have many sexualities and different ways of reproducing. And I wonder, what would it look like? What could it enlighten for us about the sex lives of people if we look from a plant sex framework?
The sex life of plants, they have more fun. So you can get plants that are hermaphrodites, you can get plants that are male and female. So you can have plants that make love with themselves, make love with other plants. Some of them don't make love at all. Some plants can utilize in their reproduction other animals, such as lizards and birds and insects. And there's one, now I don't think we ought to learn from this, but there is one ridiculous example, and that's the agave plant. And this is the one that tequila, we might talk about gorgeous drugs again, but tequila is from. And this has a very peculiar sex life. For about 30 years, it doesn't even bother about sex. And then what it will do, it will produce this massive, almost 10-foot spike. It has to be seen in the desert where it grows. And then it waits for its desired partner, and its desired partner is a bat. And once fertilization has occurred and seed set, then it dies. So I used to tell my students, but this is a lesson. If you're a lecturer, never crack a joke, because they never laugh at it. But if you remember Futurama, there was one episode where they visit a planet full of women. And I used to say this is the ultimate example of death by snoo-snoo. And there underpins my point. So I think it's a difficult one. What can we learn from plants? Then we start to become very abstract. So we can say we can learn patience, we can learn symmetry. But with regards to human emotions, then again we're in this difficult sort of anthropomorphic trap.
Okay, and I feel you want to talk about drugs. So
I do.
This is for Paul as well. Why do we desire to shift our perception in ways that sometimes can be endangering for us, surely, to be
Yeah.
under the influence of alcohol, other substances, caffeine. All
Yeah.
kinds of things.
I wonder whether that's, I will answer that, but I think that Mike has an interesting perspective on why plants might want to kerfuddle a
Yes,
human.
yeah. So again, we have to go back to this wonderful relationship of insects with plants. So land plants have been with us for about 400 million years. And they've been eaten by insects for about 400 million years. And over this time period, plants have created chemicals to dissuade herbivory. And there's three sorts of chemicals. There's one that can kill the herbivore outright, or it can dissuade it from eating. Or, and this is the real sort of nub of the issue of drugs, is it can enable its predator unconscious or facilitate that predator being predated on by other organisms. So what you find is if you've got a chemical that is ultimately fatal for another organism, eventually that's going to be overcome. That discipline will be overcome. Also, herbivores can overcome feed dissuading chemicals as well. But when it comes to the idea that you've got chemicals that alter behavior, then that might be a more favorable strategy for plants.
Yeah.
And we see a whole load of drugs that plants produce that have these behavior altering properties. Some plants actually produce insect hormones, so they regulate the breeding behavior of their predator insects. They produce fatal mutants in these insects. Other plants can produce chemicals which alter the sort of fecundity of mammals. But with regards to the human relationship with these chemicals, then, of course, this is where this idea of sin comes in and desire. Because initially, if we look at cannabis, for instance, the idea is that this was incredibly important in religious ceremonies. But then all of a sudden, we have, particularly in America, in the 1930s, 40s, and 1920s in UK, you start to see it being suppressed. And the reason why it's suppressed is not because of health. We have to be careful because now we could use a health argument. But it was because of pious religion and also of inherent racism. When we look at the banning of cocaine and heroin, or the control of that in 1916, that's more to do with concern about the effects it was having on troops during the First World War. You get this wonderful sort of sexism creeping in as well. So in the UK, they brought in pub closing hours because they were concerned that the women that were working in the munitions factory during the First World War, it could be dangerous for them to get off their heads, so to speak. And then they brought in 3.5% beer and lower, so they were controlling the alcohol content of the beer. So I find all this thing fascinating.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting is that in terms of human desire, in terms of pleasure, pursuit of pleasure, there are certain things which make sense in terms of taking drugs to increase one's alertness or to relax one. But the idea of hallucinogenics is a bit of a mystery, but yet every society has discovered them independently. Mm-hmm. And so whether that be LSD in Europe and America, or psilocybin from mushrooms, or ayahuasca from plant-based brews in South America. So there's this desire to lose one's consciousness, yet a plant could exploit that and befuddle a human in interesting ways. But why do we do this? Well, some really interesting neuroscience on this, to see what happens when someone takes psilocybin, for example. There's a network within the brain called the default mode network, which is active when we're mind wandering, when we're thinking about our autobiographical memories, anything self-referent, it's very active. And what you find with, it's also about as far removed anatomically as possible from our primary sensory systems. So it's not tethered to the outside world in some ways. Psilocybin completely reduces the connectivity of this network when we're under the influence of it. And it seems to be correlated with the effect of merging with the surrounding environment and the complete disillusion of the self. So this seems to be a desirable state for people to engage in, possibly because it links to the notion of spirituality, of losing and dissolving the self temporarily to have that experience. So that's interesting. It's becoming really interesting at the moment in terms of psychedelic therapy. Now, this is not something which is legal in Ireland. I believe it's is in Australia at the moment, and it's still very much in a kind of preliminary stage. But people with intractable depression having really positive results from this experience. And it's not like a typical pharmaceutical approach where somebody gives you a drug, they wait for a physiological reaction. Psychedelic therapy is you take a controlled amount of the hallucinogen, and you have two therapists with you during that experience, and then afterwards you reflect on what happened to you during the experience as well. And in some cases, just one dose or maybe two doses, people have quite a transformative effect on their mental health, which when they were previously in a really dire situation. So there's some really interesting, powerful effects from psychedelics, which can bring people back into the world, which is exciting.
But again, we have this question of legality coming into it. And I mean, one of the problems about some of these drugs that plants produce, and if we go back to the case of cannabis, if we look at the sort of content of cannabis in the 1970s and 80s, then it was about 2%, the specific alkaloid. And with the banning of the import of cannabis from Mexico in America, then what we see is this initiation of plant breeding, of producing better cannabis crops. And now we have this rather dangerous concentration of about 20%. So the modern sort of strains of cannabis are far stronger. And that might have a health effect. But it's an example of humans taking something and changing it to twist for their desires.
You say this is a legal issue, but would there not also be an ethical issue? You mentioned ayahuasca, it's becoming quite a big industry.
Yeah.
So is there a sense in which there's certain communities are maybe having to, or catering to the desires of other communities, even the spiritual desires, but based on an economic position that's perhaps not what they would choose?
Yeah.
You could call it ethnobotany tourism, and that exists. And as long as you protect the rights of the indigenous population that produces and have this as part of their culture, what I am slightly uncertain about is if ayahuasca retreats in Ireland. And I was just Googling last night. There is one apparently in Clare Morris. So this is totally away from the cultural aspect of it. This is just having that experience.
You say in the context, so even though there might be kind of neo-colonial overtones, if it's in the context where it's local, the knowledge is localized, you see it as a different.
Yes, and if there's no loss of resource from that from that culture, I think that's important. We have these legal agreements with regards to harvesting plants that have specific chemical properties. So it takes many, many years to produce a drug from a plant. And if we knew, for instance, which plants to look for to better hone in our search for new drugs, then all the better. And of course, what we do is we interview people, we interview tribes, or I mean, I'm being very colonial now, I shouldn't be there. But we interview people who have this inherent knowledge of a history of plants and their medicinal uses. Now, what then happens is you have international law that underpins their rights to that.
It's kind of bringing me onto, even though it's a different thing, the question of desire and violence. Can there be
Can a desire for violence be healthy?
Over to you, Paul.
I'm not sure about healthy, but in the context I was discussing earlier, if we think of Freud's death instinct, thanatos, I think it's healthy to have a self-destructive attitude to certain societal expectations to peel away that influence. And I think that, in a sense, is a form of violence to the self, which ultimately, if successful, means that you're more likely to discover your life instinct, eros, in that sense. But in terms of violence, in terms of its actuality, I don't think it can be healthy.
I'm loath to put the plant argument there, because there are certain relationships, plants, and of course plants and insects, that are inherently violent, because you get insectivorous plants. But you also get plants that search out other plants. These are parasitic plants, and there is inherent violence there. They tap into the other plant body. So, but this is just the plant side, so it goes away from the seriousness of the subject.
Do you take plants seriously?
I take plants very seriously, but we must never anthropomorphize.
Anthropomorphism is interesting. Mike gets quite annoyed with anthropomorphism, and I try to convince him that it's something which we do very reflexively. We can't help but do it, and it's partly linked to our language. So we might talk about having an inner monologue, but actually most of us have an inner dialogue. And this is because when we're growing up, we play with our dollies and our teddies, and we talk to them. We do something called private speech, where we chat away to our dolly, and then we imitate them chatting back to us. And this is actually quite important for the formulation of our inner thoughts, because that eventually internalizes to our inner thoughts. So if you don't believe me, just think about walking down the aisles of the supermarket, and you go in and you say, in your head, not out loud, because that'd be kind of weird, you'd say, okay, I want some Cocoa Pops. Where is it? Okay, it's over there. Now some muesli. Will I have some wine? Well, it's only Tuesday. Wait.
Outlandish theatre platform creates performances in which professional and community performers collectively explore what theatre is for and how theatre relates to our everyday in extraordinary times. For the last 12 years, Maud and Bernie have experimented in an ongoing dialogue with the participant as performer, director, and audience member. As artists, we focus on the interplay between spaces, sound, lighting, costume design, and the content of performers' perspectives and lives. Our performances balance on the shared everyday sublime and the end game of the Anthropocene, where people's destruction of the planet might lead to its extinction. Some desires, as small and self-contained as they may seem to some, threaten the structure of our society so much that many different mechanisms must be deployed to deny them at their root. Sometimes these desires are openly condemned. Much of the time, though, they are simply made invisible or ridiculous, unnatural or other, to convince populations that they could not possibly desire that. In the meantime, other ways of being are broadcast as the unquestioned default setting. It's a bit like when you see ads on TV or YouTube